Hello and welcome to the Recruit Rockstars podcast, where we focus on the people part of your business. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I interview a world-class expert on talent and recruiting and scaling your business so that you can do exactly that. Whether you're venture capital backed, private equity backed, I don't care. The hardest part is building your team. And so I look for experts who have a really unique point of view on that. And I found one. She's in San Francisco, and her name is Sarah Frier. Now, Sarah, you probably know her. You've probably seen her because she's been on Bloomberg for many years. She's been with Bloomberg News for over 8 years. And she wrote a fascinating book that we're going to talk about today called No Filter. And it's the inside story of Instagram, which, if you're not familiar with the inside story, we're going to get kind of a sneak peek of that and how a 13-person company, 13, sells to Facebook for $1 billion, that's with a B, dollars. So with all that said, welcome to the show, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about this topic.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to have you on. It is fascinating, whether you use it or whether you don't use it. It's kind of hard to argue that it's really changed our culture in some pretty meaningful way, right?
It really has been an incredible impact, and I think that goes to the founders. Every tech company ends up being a reflection of the people who lead it and what they value. And the people who started Instagram, they had this real appreciation for creativity and artistry and taste, and they tried to build an app, the kind of app that they would want to use, where
Yeah.
people who are good at what they do or have an interesting perspective on the world can be lifted up and followed by others, and we can get these windows into people's worlds. And what it's turned into, really, like you said, is an engine of our culture.
Yeah.
That
And
this is
it
placed
it
our
changes
culture.
our culture and it reflects our culture. It's kind of like a loop, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So before we dig into that, this is incredibly well researched, and I want listeners to really understand that. You should get full credit for that because I'm sure it was a ton of work. Just give a quick sense of the kind of access that you got, both, people that work there, people that used to work there, et cetera. Who were kind of your inputs in writing the book?
Well, I talked to hundreds of people. I don't think that you can fully tell the inside story of Instagram without talking to both current and former employees, both the kinds of employees that the company is happy to set you up with to talk to, and the people who maybe shouldn't be talking to you. And then beyond that, the competitors and the others that are building their careers off of this app, the ecosystem that's developed around Instagram, and the folks at Snapchat and Twitter and other places like that, and the venture capitalists. So I tried to get sort of a broad swath of folks who were really involved in building this company, even beyond those who worked there.
Great. So you really got a 360 view. So what, as we talk about the people part, let's go back to the beginning, kind of rewind the clock. Kevin and Mike start this business, and it really is not an old company. For those that don't know, do you recall roughly when they started it?
It's almost 10 years old. They
Okay.
started
So
right around now.
yeah. Wow.
Right around the
Incredible.
summer. They were waiting for Mike Krieger to get his visa,
Yeah.
and it's always an issue you deal with in these
Yeah.
recruiting situations. Gotta get them.
Always.
Gotta get. But Kevin Systrom knew that he wanted to start this company with Mike. Like that was his top priority, is to have a good founder, a co-working relationship. And so
Yeah.
I think that is the foundation that really helped Instagram, especially after it was acquired, because they had each other against this big behemoth, Facebook, and they were able to establish, like, this is our culture, this is what we care about and what we're willing to fight for. And Kevin had experience with less harmonious founder relationships because he interned at Odeo,
Yeah.
which became Twitter, where he
Yep.
saw the clash between Jack Dorsey and Ev Williams, and the different things that people brought to the table there. So he knew that he wanted to work with Mike Krieger. So that's where it all starts.
And they knew each other as friends, or did he kind of recruit Mike as a co-founder?
Well, they were both coding for fun in coffee shops on the weekends and in the same neighborhood. And so Kevin would sort of bounce ideas off of Mike with this new app. And eventually, when he first raised money from VCs, then one of the very first VCs, Steve Anderson, told him, I'm not going to give you money if you don't have a co-founder.
Yeah.
That's part of the deal. And so
It's a
Kevin thought,
requirement for a lot of venture
it's a
capitalists, right?
requirement for a lot of VCs. And Kevin was not especially technical. He had this great vision, but he was sort of learning to code as he went along. And so he knew he needed somebody more technical. Mike was very technical, and he thought, who better to do this with than somebody who I have this nice friendship with.
Got it. So as you had all these interviews, what did you kind of take away as the spirit or the DNA of the culture? What made it unique? Every company, every startup has one. Some are sales led, some are product led, some are operations led. What was the DNA before their Facebook acquisition?
Absolutely about setting the right tone, simplicity, making sure that the app made it easy to use. I mean, they wanted to build something that was intended for a mobile phone. So they wanted it to be something that would load quickly, that would be intuitive, and that would be mainstream. And initially, the first thing they built was too complicated. They built this app called Bourbon, which had all sorts of check-ins, and you could tell your friends you were going somewhere and they could join you. And it did have photo uploads, but it was like a complicated system where you had to email the photo in, and it just was too hard to use. So they really stripped it down, and they decided that they wanted to build something simple, because that was the biggest barrier to any usage. And they really kept that culture throughout the company, even after joining Facebook. As you know, the Facebook product, it's got events, it's got groups,
it's pretty bloated by this point.
Dating, it's got e-commerce,
Yeah.
it's got marketplace, it's got messaging, and they just wanted it to be something where you post a photo, it's a square photo only. That constraint is something that breeds creativity, they thought.
So much like Apple's ethos is much about simplicity and clean design.
Absolutely.
It sounds like similar inspiration.
Very similar ethos to Apple. I would agree with that.
What did you learn about the types of people that they hired? And I don't mean functions or job functions, but the characteristics of those people. Were they super smart, like Google tends to hire? Were they quirky? Were they product people? What was the gist of the culture?
Definitely more in the quirky line of thinking. Listen, Kevin Systrom worked at Google. Mike Krieger interned at Microsoft. They knew this tech ethos where you hire somebody who went to an Ivy League school. They've got to be a CS degree or an engineering degree, and all of those accolades. Like, they breed a lot of the same kind of thinking within an organization. And Mike and Kevin knew that they were building a culture product, so they looked for people who had interests beyond tech.
Passions. Yeah.
Maybe they were really into literature. Maybe they were really into surfing. Maybe they were really into cocktail making. I mean, people who had some sort of well-rounded nature, and they actually didn't care where you went to school. In fact, Shane Sweeney, one of their first engineers, I don't think he even had a college degree, but he was a damn good engineer. And so they just really looked for people who were obsessed with Instagram, and thought that it could do something good and exciting.
Because they were trying to appeal to such a broad base, were you able to assess anything in the culture or the hiring around diversity or inclusion or a well-rounded organization, because they were trying to reach all sorts of people around the world?
I think that they would reflect on it and say that they probably had, like, with 13 employees, there were a few queer employees, LGBT, but I don't think that they had a lot of racial diversity. And I think that that's because they were starting off of really who they came into contact with. They were growing so quickly that they didn't have a lot of time to recruit.
Yeah.
And they didn't make it a top priority until they were really desperate.
Got
And
it. Yeah.
even when it comes down to the Facebook acquisition, 18 months after Instagram is created, they were still really strapped for resources. As one VC explained to me, they were too hungry to eat. They weren't spending a lot of their time on recruiting, and when they did recruit, Kevin Systrom was incredibly particular about the kinds of people he wanted to have around him, and the types of people that made sense in his
Yeah.
mind were those who were willing to devote their entire lives to Instagram and
Yeah. I've
spend their
studied that it was an all in type of attitude, right?
all in.
Yeah.
That was the
Yeah.
most important quality. Like nights and weekends, you got to be all in, because we're only going to hire a few people because we just simply don't have time to find more. And I do think that hurts diversity, because then you're really not getting, you're not getting parents, you're not getting anyone who's not in San
Yeah.
Francisco.
Yeah.
I mean, there were certainly a few parents in the in the mix, but I think that's something that Kevin and Mike eased up on as they started to realize, okay, wait, maybe it is good for people to have more well-rounded lives and see how people are using this product in the real world.
So that was life before the acquisition by Facebook. There are 13 people when that deal happened. What's your best guess on why? Was it because of a focus on minimizing costs, or was it to keep the organization tight and simple? Or, I mean, that's a pretty unusual size organization, especially because they'd raised venture capital. So money should not have been an issue. Why such a small team?
Well, the business at that point wasn't that complicated. It was, there was no business model to speak
Yeah.
of.
There was no
It
revenue.
was,
Right? Was
there was
there at
no
the time?
revenue,
Yeah. Yeah.
and really it was about keeping it alive. And they should have had a lot more people on the team, and they didn't. And maybe that's one reason why they were so agreeable
Yeah.
to the acquisition, is because they knew that if they stayed independent, they might have to hire 80 more people in order
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
handle the next stage of growth. The app was constantly crashing, never in a way that was super noticeable to users, but Mike Krieger, the co-founder, was always trying to fix it, sometimes in the middle of the night, especially when people in Japan would wake up and something would happen there. He would scramble to fix the servers. But there wasn't really a strong business side, a strong infrastructure side. They were kind of flying by the seat of their pants, growing as fast as they possibly could, just to keep the service alive.
When it came time to think about selling to Facebook, from your research, was it a difficult decision, or was it, we're getting $1 billion, there's 13 of us, this is a no-brainer, let's do it? What were the considerations, again, especially around the people part, how it might change the culture? Was that a big factor for them, or what did your research show?
Well, I think that this is, it's always a tough situation when your top competitor, I guess Facebook was so much bigger then, but
Yeah.
they saw it as a future competitor, says, either we're going to buy you or we're going to compete with you. And to be purchased by Facebook is to knock out a major competitor. So that was one big component. I think the biggest thing, and this goes to the question of people and culture, the biggest thing that convinced them to sell to Facebook versus Twitter or any of the other companies that poked in and said, we'd love to have you on the team. The thing that made Facebook exciting was Facebook said, you can remain independent. We will let you maintain your culture, maintain your vision, and we won't try to control you. We are just going to give you all of the resources and none of the risk. And that sounds so appealing. Of
It's
course,
pretty tempting. Yeah.
reality doesn't always work out like that. But the Instagram acquisition really started this idea of becoming a company within a company. And I think as your listeners are dealing with what the future of their small companies might be, the getting acquired by a big company that will let you remain independent is still a big model that these companies use. It is turning out to be not as rosy a future as imagined then, but certainly that promise of the Instagram acquisition and its early success
Yeah.
was something that convinced the WhatsApp founders to sell to Facebook and the
Which was
Oculus
which
founders to
was
sell to
after Instagram.
which was after
Yeah.
Instagram. And so this idea that you could join somewhere and remain a company and remain founders, really, with your own CEO title and your own vision, was extremely appealing and somewhat new.
But it sounded good in concept, but it didn't last too long. Let's talk about after the deal. What did your reporting and research show changed? How long did it take for things to really change? And what changed the most that really altered the relationship between Instagram and the mothership?
I think I noted earlier in this conversation how Instagram was extremely design focused
Yeah,
and culture
product focused.
focused.
Yep.
And Facebook is notoriously growth focused, and they care about the numbers. Instagram cares about the people. Now, they're both ways to grow, right? Instagram thinks that if you focus on your highest profile users, if you try to bring good content to the forefront, if you focus on cultivating moments on Instagram, things that people want to participate in culturally, that's going to drive growth. Well, Facebook thought, why would you focus on one user or one set of users when you could be focusing on millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people and making tweaks to products that have a measurable impact? So that growth focus at Facebook was really infused throughout the organization in terms of how everyone was rewarded in doing their jobs. If you could increase engagement by a small percentage point, if you could increase usage, if you could increase Facebook in a certain geography, that's what you wanted to do. You wanted to build all of your HR systems around those goals.
Yeah. The two
Instagram really didn't
perspectives,
know how to fit.
they could not be more diametrically opposed, right? I mean,
Because how do you measure the success of getting a K-pop band onto Instagram, right? Instagram would celebrate those, they would call it onboarding, right? We got BTS to use Instagram. This is huge. But, if you don't see it, maybe Korea goes up 10% in the next couple months. Can you really attribute that to that decision? And so I think that there was a lot of confusion about how and whether Instagram would be rewarded for pursuing growth in the way that it wanted to pursue growth versus Facebook. And the Facebook employees were really looking at Instagram and saying, like, why are you wasting your time on things like that? And why are you so resistant to adding new bells and whistles to your product, especially around notifications? Like Facebook thought that those re-engagement tactics were really important. And because they saw it in the numbers, if you send people an email that says, hey, you should click on your Facebook profile, a good percentage of people will. But Instagram didn't want to annoy anybody. So that tension started at the beginning, but over time.
Did it start right away, that tension, after the deal?
Right away. And in fact, the most shocking thing to me that I learned was that, like, the second that Instagram joins, within the first couple of weeks, the growth team takes one of their engineers out for lunch and says, like, we really have to figure out if you are the reason that there's going to be a decline in posting photos on Facebook. Because if that's going to happen, then we can't help you.
Sure.
So right away, Instagram learns that Facebook cares so much about growth that they're even willing to squander this $1 billion they spent on the acquisition in the name of Facebook's longevity. But for a while, Zuckerberg especially was very insistent on giving them space in the engineering and product side of the organization, which is what the founders cared about. Now, in the Sheryl Sandberg, if anyone's familiar with Facebook and how it's structured, in the Sheryl Sandberg side of the business, the operations, the advertising, all
Yeah,
of
the
that,
commercial part. Yeah.
the commercial part and the structural part, all of the big company resources like HR and training um, and recruiting, all of that was quickly part of Instagram. So when the founders consider their independence, we're really only talking about, at least for the first
Yeah.
few years,
Yeah.
independence of the engineering
Yeah. The
and
product part. Yeah.
product side
Yeah.
and
So now
design.
it's approaching. Now it's approaching the end, right? It comes down to a bit of a showdown, from what I understand. This was fall of 18. Is that right?
Yes, that's when the
And
founders ultimately leave their baby 6 years
yeah.
after joining Facebook.
And was there much of a discussion, or they just said we're done?
Oh, there were a thousand discussions. The thing that, when we're talking about people and how that affects the future of Instagram, Facebook, they realized, or at least Mark Zuckerberg was concerned, that if Instagram continued its accelerating growth with all of Facebook's resources that I mentioned earlier, the advertising resources, the help in links from Facebook back to
Mm-hmm.
Instagram, all of
Mm-hmm.
that Instagram would eventually cannibalize the Facebook product. And one of the consequences of that conclusion was we should just not give Instagram as many resources. We shouldn't let them hire as many engineers. We should make sure that we integrate these assets as much as possible and have Instagram lean on Facebook's existing infrastructure. And so that was a problem, because when the founders were looking at the problems ahead for Instagram, this was a time of reckoning for Facebook. They were realizing that they were so focused on growth that they
Yeah.
weren't cleaning up their messes,
Yeah.
and it was costing them in terms of manipulation of the 2016 presidential election, in terms of Cambridge Analytica, the instance where data was given to a developer who then gave it to political operatives. And so Instagram's looking around the corner and saying, well, we're getting to about the same size that
Yeah.
Facebook was when it started having all these issues. We're
Yeah.
nearing on 1 billion users. What do we need to do to make sure that this doesn't happen to us? And Instagram has very different problems, because they have anonymity, where Facebook has real names. They don't have resharing, so they don't have virality.
Yeah.
They have things organized within hashtag communities. People have multiple accounts. There's so many different things. Like, if you're trying to
It's a
build
different structure.
two
Yeah.
different structures, yeah. So
Yeah.
if you're
Yeah.
trying to build a model that works for Facebook, it's not necessarily going to work for Instagram. But that didn't really matter, because Facebook thought, well, in the line of priorities that we have, it's more important to solve the Facebook issues than it is to solve the Instagram issues, because what we value most is tackling the problems that affect the most people. And Instagram is slightly smaller. So the founders felt like that was really a losing battle for them. If they couldn't freely hire, if they couldn't freely allocate resources in the areas that they wanted to allocate them, then they felt like they were being set up to fail.
Yeah. The story changed from "we'll leave you alone, you'll be independent" to "we'll act as though this is a subsidiary or division." And it sounds like the two of them,
Absolutely.
that's just not what they signed up for.
Not what they signed up for. They realized, like, Kevin Systrom realized, I'm not a CEO anymore.
Yeah.
I'm actually just like the head PM of Instagram,
Yeah.
or like the
Yeah.
head of
Right.
the department,
It's not the
which is
job he signed up for.
not what he wanted, especially when you're working in this world of Silicon Valley visionaries. Like, everyone wants to be able to own their successes. Well, you also have to own your failures as well. And when you're within an organization that won't let you have directional control over those things,
Yeah.
it just felt a little bit impossible.
It's such a common story. Maybe not as successful or big a story, not as many zeros, but uh, it's just so common in Silicon Valley and all around the world. When a business is acquired, initially the promise is made, we'll let you run it, we'll keep you independent. But eventually the the two paths kind of collide, and the CEO, the board, the leadership team of the parent company say, this isn't going to work anymore. We need to fold it in. And then the entrepreneurs leave and start something else great. Do you think that'll happen in this case? Do you think that Kevin and Mike might go on to do it again, or are they going to sail into the sunset with $1 billion?
I think they do plan on doing another company, and they probably will do it together since they have that tight relationship.
Yeah.
But I think they're going to take their time to do it right, as they did with Instagram. Listen, I think that one of the things that's really hard is managing up in that situation.
Yeah.
Kevin Systrom calculated back around 2016, 2015, if I solve Instagram's growth issues, if I make sure that we have a robust advertising platform, if I help Facebook crush Snapchat, because we know Facebook loves clearing the competition, maybe Mark will reward that and give me more resources and let my Instagram baby thrive. Well, the opposite happened. Mark Zuckerberg felt threatened by Instagram and then started to restrict it. So I think that it's really tricky in those situations when you're trying to anticipate how to win.
It's a very instructive story for any entrepreneur, anyone who's thinking about starting a company or is leading a small company. You've got to get your hands on this book. Sarah, I cannot give you enough credit for the deep research that you did. How can people get their hands on No Filter, the inside story of Instagram?
Well, it's sold around the world, anywhere you want to buy books. It's an especially good time to support your local bookstore, but if you can't find it there, you find it really anywhere. No Filter it has a slightly different cover depending on what country you're in, but it's the same story.
And it's a great story, and you told it so well. And there's nothing like a pandemic to give people plenty of time to read books. So this is a great one to add to your list. Sarah, thanks again for making the time.
Thank you so much for having me.